Welcome back. Up to this point in this tutorial series, we've been talking about the very basics of Python. But now we actually have enough components that we can start to do some interesting things. We can start to build programs that actually do some basic analyses for us. So let's start by just calculating the most common character in a paragraph. And here I've written out all of the code that does this, and we'll go through it piece by piece. So first, I'm just starting with a paragraph. In the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London and proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the Army. If you're not familiar with this particular line, this comes from a study in Scarlet, which is the first Sherlock Holmes novel, something I'm very interested in and I often teach classes on. And I print that out just so you can see that. So if we want to get information out of this, we need to start actually tracking a few things. We're interested in what is the most common character here, and what is that character's frequency. Now, if you know anything about English or linguistics, you'll know that E is almost certainly going to be the answer, because this is just the most common character in English. Knowing that, let's just go ahead and do this anyway. So if you remember from earlier, we can do a few things. We can iterate through every character in a string, and we can count. So what we can do, for character in my paragraph, I'm just going to go into my paragraph.count character, and I'll save this as a variable that I call frequency. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, okay, well, if the value of this frequency is larger than anything I've seen before, that means it's the most common character. So what I can do is I can check against most frequent character. When I start, this is set at 0. So if I'm going to say, if the frequency of whatever character I'm looking at is greater than this particular value, then make this particular value equal to this frequency. So this starts at 0. So the first iteration, which is this capital I can just say, how often do capital I's occur? And let's say it happens once. Well, 1 is greater than 0. So make MCC frequency, most common character frequency, equal to 1. And set the most common character equal to the character. And then in the next step, it's going to go to the n, and it's going to count up that n. And let's say it happens 10 times. So now 10 is greater than 1, and we're now going to save n into this variable. That's all there is to it. It's so simple. And then we can just print the results. So let's go over here. Let's print the results of Python 12 most common character 1. Let's run this, and here we can see I printed out that paragraph. And then we see that the most common character is space, which occurs 127 times. Well, this clearly isn't the result that we were really going for. So let's go back and change our code so it actually doesn't look at that space. Now, essentially, I'm going to be showing you the exact same code and only making one small change. And in this case, I'm saying if character does not equal space, then run all the rest of this code. So notice that now this code here, which in the last code was here, is now over here. So it's inside this if loop. So I'm just saying, you know what, let's not pay attention to the spaces. Otherwise, do everything exactly the same. Oh, one thing I should point out is if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can highlight things and use Shift-Tab to unindent and Tab to indent. Very useful thing to know how to do. So let's go ahead and run this. So when we run the second one of these, we can see that the most common character is indeed E, which occurs 77 times. But we can actually refine this a little more. What if there are two characters that actually occur the same number of times? Now, we would really want to know this if it's the case, and often it's not the case in English, but here I've just changed my paragraph to, hi, my name is Paul Viertaler. So what I'm going to do is instead of creating an empty string to hold the most common character, I'm going to use a list. So the most common character equals this empty list. So now I have, for every character in my paragraph, if character does not equal space, what I'm going to do is I'm going to count up that character, so all of this is the same, except now, instead of saving that character as a string, I'm going to set it as a list. So most common character equals char. But That's only if the frequency is greater than the most common frequency. What happens if it's the same? Well, if it's equal to the current value, then save it with the other character. So instead of creating a new list with just character in it, I'm going to append the character to the most common character list. So then what I can do is I can just print out the results that way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the values each time to track what's actually happening so you can see what the logic is actually doing. So we'll go ahead and run this, common character 3. What we can see is it says, OK, H happens once, I happens 3 times, and it runs a few times without hitting anything that happens 3 times. But then it gets to an A, and then it adds that. And then the next loop doesn't see anything new. Then it gets an E. But then it gets to another I, and then another A, another I, another E. And then we get this list that's all convoluted that says the most common characters is or are I, A, E, I, A, I, E, A, E, which occur 3 times. This is, again, not exactly the behavior that we want. So let's go back and see if we can fix this problem. So what we can do is we can look at this version of the code. So we can say all of this is if the frequency is greater than the most common frequency, that means we've never seen anything this common, so let's just make a new list. But what we can also do is when we say, OK, these 2 frequencies are equal, let's say, is this character already in most common character? If it is, don't add it. But if it's not in the most common character, then go ahead and add it. So if we do this instead, we'll run this. And now we'll see that we never have more than a single instance of a given character in the list. So now we have a much more efficient implementation. But we can actually make it even better. Let's look at the next version of this and say, well, there's actually a lot of wasted effort in the previous version. We only need to run count a single time per character. I don't need to check if I is in this 3 or 4 times. I should only do it once. So what I can do is I can actually get the unique characters by using this set function. So a set in Python is a data object that can only include unique values. So it's a very handy way of making sure that something is unique. So I'll just print that out so you can see what it looks like. And now what I'm doing is I'm doing exactly the same thing, except I am iterating through every character in that unique characters set. So now we only look at every character a single time. So I'll go ahead and run this. And we can see that the most common character is, oops, that was the last one. Let's run this again. So we can see that the unique characters are comma, y, s, h, i, p, so on and so forth. And it ran in 17 loops. Excuse me. It ran in 17 loops instead of 30 loops. And we can see that I calculated that by just looking at what's the length of the unique characters versus the length of the entire paragraph. Now notice I didn't make sure everything was lowercase, so an uppercase p is different than a lowercase p. So if you implement this, you might want to also change that. What happens, though, if instead of characters, we want to look at words? Well, let's do that. We've got code that does the same thing, only except for words. So we can actually really easily adjust the code from the most common character to the most common word by splitting the paragraph into a list of words instead of characters. So to do this, I'm just going to get the words in the paragraph by splitting on the spaces. Now, there are more sophisticated ways of doing this that we will see in this course, but for now, this will work. So you'll also notice that throughout this code, I have changed the variables to reflect that I'm looking at words and not characters. This isn't required, but it will help us understand the code better. So again, I'm getting a set for the words, which are unique words, and then everything else is exactly the same. So you'll notice that I'm actually checking frequency inside the words list and not the myParagraph variable. Because if I looked for word in unique words, and I was searching for the inside of the string, it would also match things like these and them, which is not behavior that we want. So here, I'm just saying words.count word. So notice that lists also have this .count method. And otherwise, everything's exactly the same. So we'll run this. Python 13, common words, 1. We can see the most common words is the, which occurs 10 times. That's fair and also exactly expected. But let's add a few more refinements to this. Let's start by cleaning the paragraph up a little bit. What if we don't really want to concern uppercase I as any different than lowercase I, it? So let's just make everything lowercase, which I do here on line 6. My paragraph equals my paragraph dot lower. I also want to delete punctuation. I don't really care if London period or London has a period after it or not. These aren't two different words, so what I can do is I can use replace to replace all of the commas and the periods. Now, we'll also, in those more sophisticated ways of splitting these texts, we can handle this more efficiently. But otherwise, the code is exactly the same. We'll run this. We'll, of course, see that the is still the most common word, but now it occurs 11 times instead of 10 because there is a capital T. Adding another iterative refinement, we'll look at the next piece of code. And alternatively, instead of just looking at the most common word, we can actually look at all of the words and see how common they are using a dictionary. So instead of having that list, I'm going to create a dictionary with word frequencies. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through word in unique words if word does not equal a space, and it's not going to because I split on those spaces, so space doesn't exist. I can actually get rid of this. Then I can say words.count word, and then word frequencies. And here in this dictionary, I use the word as the key and set it to this frequency. And so this will create a nice list, a nice dictionary full of all of my word frequencies. It's a really handy thing to know how to do. So rather than looking at this kind of random representation of these frequent words, we might want to sort them so we can understand what's going on a little more effectively. So we'll take a look at this code. And I should point out that you technically can't sort a dictionary and keep it as a dictionary, but we can get a sorted representation. So everything is exactly the same until we sort the keys by their values. So down here on line 20, what I'm doing is I'm using that sorted function, and I'm saying, let's take the word frequencies. This is our dictionary. And then I'm telling it the key that we want to use is just the values. So word frequencies dot get. It looks a little weird, but this is how you sort a dictionary by its values. I can also do the exact same thing by saying the reverse equals true. And notice that I've broken this apart onto 2 lines. This originally looked like this. This is just to make it look a little bit nicer. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the sorted words list, because this up here will return a list. And then I'm going to go through the top 10 items in the reverse sorted list and print out the word itself, and then just get its value out of this dictionary. So I'll go over here, and I'll go ahead and run common words 4. And we can see that it starts with a list that's actually words that occur once here, and then the at the end, which is the most common word. Excuse me. And then we can see that I've printed out the 10 most common words with their values. So we've already built a piece of code that will go through a document, in this case just a paragraph, and tell us what the most common words are and give us all of those frequencies. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about errors and how to correct them. So I hope you come back, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.